we were trying to blend reality with politics and tilted a little too much toward management responsibility, I think. But so yes and no. There were times we had good experiences and times we had difficult experiences, but that's all part of the system in which we live. And you just simply have to recognize that there are going to be some times you get set back like that, and other times you ride a wave to accomplish things you want to accomplish.
You gotta be flexible and.
I remember a guy, a senior person in a conservation organization in Washington, a Wildlife Management Institute, who once told me, he said, whenever an administration changes, he said, we have a list of about 10 things we want to accomplish. He said, we've never seen an administration that wants to do those 10 things. He said, but we've never seen one that didn't want to do at least 2 or 3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
He said, so we have to kind of pick and choose among our priorities as to which ones we're going to accomplish something with, and we let the others lie somewhat dormant until the opportunity is there. And I thought that was a very pragmatic approach, rather than just simply saying, hey, you know, this is what we want to do, and it's a do or die kind of thing.
It is. You take the avenue that's open, that's right. Yeah.
So after 33 years of it, I decided that I wanted to get out while I still had my health and energy and enthusiasm to do some other things. And so I, as I mentioned, retired, but lived both places. And so I still have a lot of contacts up there and a lot of things I do, occasionally some consulting work, things like that. But I'm much more involved in writing articles and doing photography about wildlife management. And some of it goes all the way back to things I learned 50 years ago. We're here with Tom Quay at NC State. Wood duck work, for example, is still an important part of my life. I have about 50 wood duck boxes I check regularly and study their habits, and occasionally write a magazine article about it.
You wrote a definitive book on the biology and management of the wood duck in North America.
With Jack Dermott, we put together, I think, a very interesting book published by the Lippincott Company on the world of the wood duck.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pleased to work with Jack on that because he was an outstanding photographer, and I've learned a lot from him. And I thought it was a good example of how we were both wildlife biologists, and he was a much more accomplished photographer, but he taught me a lot along the way, and we had a good partnership which exists to this day. We're still the best of friends and go on trips together and things like that. And so a lot of things that happened way back 50 years ago are things that have endured. A relationship with Tom Quay, for example. We recently established an endowment at NC State University for providing little scholarships to students. And the whole idea was built on his interest and the kinds of things I talked about of students getting out while they're students and doing project work, and being rewarded financially in a sense of maybe some of them couldn't do that because they don't have the money to keep going to school without taking a job some summer. And so we made it possible to give them an award that recognizes they put a priority on going out and working in the field for summer or semester or something like that.
As an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate. And
undergraduates really don't always really know exactly what they want to do. They look to the staff to try to help them find out what they want to do.
And so Dr. Quay and I both firmly believe in the 3 things I mentioned about how it makes them a better student to go out there and do that. And so we have that program in effect now, and each year have been making one or more awards out of the interest in that that comes from that investment. And in some other ways, a lot of things that started 50 years ago, I'm still involved in. And even though retired, I'm still involved in the wildlife management kinds of things.
I'd like to comment on when you discovered wildlife came into zoology and the curriculum. I found out you liked the wood ducks, and so I got you into undergraduate individual studies. And so you took that for 2 years. By the time you were finishing your bachelor, you almost had your master's completed. Took another year in the master's, and you had a master's degree quick. That was an efficient system.
Well, it was, and I think in large part was the kind of introduction you provided and the fact that it was able to do undergraduate projects that led on into graduate study.
We're going to tell a story you told about Jim Mary. You remember Don Stevenson? took his master's with you in wood ducks. And you would take my ornithology class down to Hester's Pond to study the wood ducks on some of these field trips. And I said, it's getting late, boys, we got to get out of here and go straight down there. Don Siemens said, we're going to stop. It isn't a question of whether we're going to stop. Dr. Hester is going to stop and have a big candy bar and a big Pepsi, or he ain't going to go. But it was fun.
It was fun. And in a lot of ways, the studies that we had going there, the students working on the wood ducks, there was an esprit de corps that's hard to match. We had volunteers too. We just put up a little notice that says on Saturday we're going to be going down putting up some wood duck boxes. Anybody who wants to go, let me know, so I know whether we need more than one vehicle and that kind of thing. I'd oftentimes have students say, I want to go, and they'd go down and help us put up duck boxes or check duck boxes. And there was a real esprit de corps. We had one vehicle to check all these things, and we were banding ducks in the nest box, tagging baby ducks, and they're only in there 24 hours, and so had to be timed just right. Students would have exams or classes, and we'd have to exchange that truck. And there was a, as I say, an esprit de corps unmatched in my career of guys working together and with enthusiasm, almost like whether they got paid or not, they wanted it to happen. And I remember one year we web tagged 96% of all the baby ducks that hatched on 11 different study areas. And that took a lot of effort to get the timing right as to when they were going to hatch and be there on the right day and all those kind of things. But they were committed to make it happen, and that was a real highlight. There were some similar kinds of things about the fishery work, but those days at NC State and working with students, graduate students, undergraduate students, volunteers, the whole business, was an important part of my career.
Good that you studied fisheries also, and then you did your research and teaching heavily in fisheries, I think. Fishery genetics?
Fishery genetics.
And,
we did some very interesting things in genetics, one of which was to study hybridization of sunfishes, both in the sense of understanding whether hybrids have a place in management, but also one of the things we found was that the relationship between success in hybridization was a measure of how far they are apart genetically. That is, if you cross two species that are very close, hardly distinguishable, you would expect to have high fertilization and hatching rates and good survival. Whereas if you cross two that are not closely related, you'd expect poorer survival at all those stages. And so that's exactly what we found, and we were able to measure through artificial insemination in the laboratory, eggs in little petri dishes and fertilizing them there. We count the fertilization rate, the hatching rate, and the survival rate up to a level we could measure them in a couple of inches long. And so if you cross two species very closely related, like a bluegill and a shellcracker or a green sunfish, you'd get high rates, almost like what you get bluegill times a bluegill. But if you crossed others that were more distantly related, we even were able to cross largemouth bass and bluegill, we had very poor survival at all those stages and a lot of problems with them, which indicated that genetically they are farther apart. So as you would expect it would be, we were able to make a lot of intermediate measurements between those two that were not so obvious, that told us a lot about the genetic relationships of those fish.
I like the story that's common in Western religions. It was something like, God does not take away from man's lot of time on earth that which he spends fishing.
I think there's some truth to that.
Hunting and fishing both.
Yeah, I believe in that one too. Well, Gene, with the experience you had, looking ahead a little bit, what do you see as our big challenges in wildlife management and conservation?
Well, Bob, when I started out, it was largely hunting and fishing kind of thing, pure hunting and fishing. And as you know even better than I, back 50 or 70 years ago, maybe 70 years ago, was a kind of a low point about many populations, and there were a lot of efforts to get the populations rebounded. White-tailed deer, turkeys, a lot of things that had really, the habitat had been disturbed, the hunting was unregulated back early part of the 1900s, and so there were a lot of management things to get the population back up. Over time, with a lot of other changes, and with the habitat continuing to be changed the way it has been done, and the population of humans growing at the rate it's grown, there are a lot of species, in addition to those that are hunted and fished, that have suffered. Water quality, for example, has had decimating effects on things like the river mussel and other bivalves. And not only those, but species of non-hunted birds and you name it. And so the challenge has been a much broader one, I think, in the sense of understanding the ecological relationships and of understanding the needs of species other than the ones that have typically been the hunted and fished for species. And so that's an important part of it, and I often say it's important to understand the needs of pileated woodpeckers, for example, and what's going to happen to them over time, and the importance of contiguous forest areas and winter areas and summer areas and feeding areas and migration routes and all those kind of things. So there's a much broader ecological approach to things now than I think there was in the earlier days, because it was somewhat simplified about looking at a few species and the needs of those species. Today it's a much broader one, and the approach is more how to retain ecological values in the face of changes in land use.
I think you're right. And the expansion of human populations too is, it affects some species much more than others. There's some that just won't tolerate many people around.
Absolutely. You know,
others that adjust well and become problems.
Well, and in between those, I oftentimes think about a mallard duck. If it doesn't have the kind of marsh it wants, it'll come and nest under your azalea bush.
That's right.
But a canvasback duck is not going to do that. It's got very specific nesting requirements, and either going to do that or it's not going to nest at all. And as you say, some species adapt so well. A Canada goose, for example, white-tailed deer, and some others that have become real pests. And in fact, that's one of the big management challenges, is how to have both recognition as a biological carrying capacity and a sociological carrying capacity as well. That probably best exemplified by the white-tailed deer. People don't know how they want them regulated, and yet they have to regulate them. And so it becomes a very emotional kind of an issue.
Yeah, and people's appreciation or interest in wildlife is shifting. You know, years ago it was hunting and fishing were the main interest that spurred wildlife work. Now you have a lot of people that are interested in it for other reasons.
Absolutely.
And
There are now 70
your
million
audience is
people
different,
watching.
see, and this creates a different
There
atmosphere.
are now 70 million people watching birds.
Yeah.
60 million of them in this country watch birds in their backyard and they feed them water.
Yeah.
That didn't happen 50 years ago.
I have a friend whose main hobby is to identify every species of bird on the North American continent and to photograph it. Now, being a photographer, I can take a relatively common bird like a great horned owl or something, and I can spend days trying to find one to photograph. He has photographed hundreds and hundreds of species, over 600. Now, some of them are the rare and occasional species that show up in North America or out in the edge of the ocean or up in the Pribilofs or whatever. But he and his wife take specific trips to go find these rare birds and to photograph them. That's his number one interest in life, I think, is to do that. And that's why he's got 600 and some species now. Frankly, I find it astounding that he can do it, and second, that he has that kind of interest in it. But I find that he's not unique. Some other people may be a little bit behind him, maybe some ahead of him, but I doubt it. But there are a lot of people who have a keen interest in when an occasional bird shows up, or a new one, or a new bird has a new migration route or something. The number of people who have an intense interest in that kind of thing.
Famous Dr. Peirce at Duke University, one of the great ecologists, used to say, everybody got a right to be a damn fool in his own particular way.
That's pretty good. Yeah.
But Bob, I'm down here a lot now, around the Wendell, Zebulon area, fortunately get my sons and grandchildren down here, take them fishing on the mill pond. And last year, I had one of those fabulous days in which I was able to show the grandkids a bluebird box with some eggs in it, adult and eggs. And 3 days later, when they looked in there, the baby birds had just hatched. And you could tell when they looked in the box before you ever asked them what they saw, that the baby birds were there. On the same trip, I took them out and we looked in some wood duck nest boxes and saw some eggs, and took them to a different box, and the young were hatching that day. And that's always a highlight, to have little baby ducks in there peeping around. And while we were looking at one of those nests, a fawn walked across a little peninsula, and while we were pointing that fawn out to the grandchildren, a second walked the same way, and so they all got to see the fawn. And so that was one of those highlight days that you couldn't plan it all coming together that way, but
Yeah.
I'm delighted that it did come that way, and I was able to show them those things. And then we took them fishing, caught a few fish too. So we had a great adventure, and hope to do that a lot more times.
Well, that's one of the fruits of retirement, is you can do those things. I enjoy doing that with our
Yeah.
grandchildren, and
Definitely.
teaching them, a couple of boys to deer hunt now, and fishing, they all love that, you know. So those are some of the things that you can enjoy in retirement.
Bob, after I retired, I told some people, I said, when I first retired, my feeling was, whatever I'm doing, I don't have much time. I've got to hurry up, because I got to get this done, because I just don't have much time. The second phase I went through was, I'm not really sure what day this is. And the third phase I went through was, I don't really care which day this is.
Yeah, that's a good feeling when you get to that.
But I've enjoyed the retirement. I'm still involved in a lot of the kinds of things I've been involved in all my life, and wildlife management in its broadest sense is my life. And so the photography I do and the writing I do is all about biology and conservation and wise management of resources and those kind of things.
The National Wildlife Society has just realized that hunting and fishing has been mainly a white Anglo-Saxon profession. You now have all the great cities, and suburbs, and inner city kids don't get any experience with wildlife and nature. And they're thinking about how they're going to try to reach the inner city kids and the Hispanics and the various foreign groups of people in this country who are forming a bigger and bigger part of the total population. How can they reach them? They're going to try.
Well, not only in Audubon, but there are a lot of organizations that have the same conclusion. A lot of the fishing organizations, fishing organizations, for example, have organized National Fishing Week, and they have the industry provide fishing tackle, and they even have loaner programs in the whole business to try to get people more comfortable doing these kind of things. So they have professional biologists as tutors to help inner city kids on special fishing days and things like that. And so there's a general recognition that a lot of organizations have come to that says next generation's got a lot of other alternatives of things to do. And if people, not just because we want people to hunt and fish, but because if they don't do those things, there's a real question of how much they will understand about the relationship of water quality, air quality, undisturbed forests, wilderness areas, or whatever, the needs of wild critters.
The great Otto Leopold once said early in the 30s, if you think that water comes from a faucet and milk comes from a bottle, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. I mean, I've heard of people when questioned about shrimp think they make them up in the kitchen like you make up a hush puppy or something. And so there's a real need for people to understand those kind of things.
Yeah, most conservation organizations have had to adapt and do a lot more in that direction, or they disappear. Times are changing. Wildlife management, I think, is going to continue to be a more important profession on down the road.
Absolutely.
You were talking earlier about getting lands you could hunt and fish on. I've seen this statement often said, if it weren't for individual state wildlife resources commissions like North Carolina, who study populations each year who set the season by the yearly population size, we wouldn't hardly have any wildlife.
Well, I think, if you look at what was happening back in the twenties and thirties, right here in North Carolina, a good example of that.
Yeah.
First off, there was no professional wildlife biologists. Second is there was essentially no hunting regulations, or if they were there was no, what we would think of today as an enforcement of them by today's standards. And there was an attitude that it was endless and you could just keep doing it, keep harvesting them. They came from somewhere else and they'd always be here.
Mhm.
And a whole series of considerations that we don't abide by those today. We recognize you've got to know more about what you're doing, and it's not an inexhaustible supply, and it's something that has to be managed one way or another.
And it has to be financed. That's the other thing. Back in those pre-World War II, you know, the license money didn't even go for the wildlife program at that time, and now it does, and that's not enough. So
It's
you
not
need
enough.
more financing,
It's
broader
not.
financing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that is one of the biggest challenges I think we all face today, is that the bill has been paid largely by the hunting and fishing population. As times change and the interest is so much broader, there's no real effective mechanism for it to be financed at the level it needs to be financed to operate in this broader arena that goes way beyond the hunting and fishing population. And so, if, for example, we're gonna know about that pileated woodpecker or the prothonotary warbler or those kind of things, where's the money coming from to do those? And those need management in some sense, just as other populations.
They do. Really do. Yeah, that's one of our big challenges for the years ahead. Gene, looking back on your career, what, if anything, would you have done different? It's been a wonderful career, it seems to
Caught
me.
more fish, caught more fish.
Well, it has been. You know, even though I talked about how I became a wildlife biologist and a fishery biologist by naivete,
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things I kind of stumbled into, but I wouldn't change it, because I think it was an advantage for me to have that, even though they're pretty narrow disciplines in a sense, to have that broader perspective for the rest of my career. And so I certainly wouldn't change that, and I'm happy with the kind of career I've had. As I say, as I mentioned, I was never eager to go to Washington, but on the other hand, I feel it was an interesting part of my career, and I feel like I made some contributions there, and I'm satisfied with it. And even though I didn't initially elect to do that, I'm glad I did. And even though I didn't initially volunteer to go say I wanted to be associate director in the Park Service, it was an important part of my background and career. One of those things very few people do, but it was an enhancing part of my career to understand how two different organizations with similar functions see things as differently as they do because of their heritage and their culture. I oftentimes compare it to, it's like you go down the street here and different families have different strategies about saving money for college education, or how much money to spend on houses or cars or whatever, how much to save versus how much to spend, or what to invest in. And so no two of them are alike. Well, bureaus are the same way. No two of them see things quite the same way. And incidentally, I might add, when we put the research components from 7 different bureaus together, in a sense, it sounds real simple. You take the people and the money and put them together in a new organization. It was not that way at all. Each one of them had a totally different strategy as to how it funded things. For example, one organization funded its whole publication and library system out of an overhead function. The next one did it out of a appropriation from Congress. And the next one did it in some hodgepodge way that I don't think even they understood it. And so by the time you figure out how to slice that money up, you've got a mishmash that's almost impossible to put together. And so there's some real major struggles, not because people weren't working diligently to make it happen, but it's because the budget systems just were so different.
I remember down in Wendell one day when you were applying to Auburn to go to undergraduate school. I said, you don't want to go on for a doctor, Gene. This is a tobacco economy. You know everybody in town, you're a happy guy. It's a tobacco economy. Why don't you just stay here and be a big tobacco man and make money? He said, nothing doing. Nothing doing.
Well, I'll tell you, most of it, you didn't advise me not to do it. You just raised the question, because the advice you've given me over the time has been good advice, and I've appreciated it, and I appreciate it today. I've enjoyed the relationship with both of you and with the organizations that you've represented all this time. And when you were director, we had a lot of interesting interactions and discussions about some of these very kind of things.
Sure did. Yeah, Gene, you've had a remarkable career. I think one of the most varied and interesting of anybody I know. And the fact that you were able to go from agency to agency and fit into programs and lead them, you know, speaks wonders for the background and the training that you've had. And I think all students need that kind of broad training, you know, and I think you can be really proud of what you've done. We all owe you a debt of gratitude, I think, for your efforts, and we wish you the best in the future.
I appreciate that.
I never reached any like the degree of success that you have of making my enemies into friends. That's a rare talent.
Well, it's a challenge, all right, and I wouldn't say I've done it in every case, but I've been pleased to be at least enough understanding of and a part of this integration of the career and political systems, and to be a translator both ways. And it does need to be translated both ways,
Sure.
because oftentimes there are very legitimate changes that need to be made that an organization resists, but to have them understand why the changes are needed, and to have other people understand how it can be made to happen, or how much of it you can make happen, are important considerations.
And that's why I think it's very essential to be involved, even people who retire, you know. That experience counts and is helpful, I think, to the people who are dealing with the problems every day. And so I'm delighted to see that you're active, and hope you stay that way, and I'm trying to do the same thing.
Well, good, good, and I appreciate your thinking that these are important things to be talked about and to be recorded, and I'm glad to be part of this.
Research shows that as you get older, the more you use your brain, the more active you are, the longer you live.
True.
Well, I'm gonna live a long time, I hope.
Well, good. I told my doctor, I said, I intend to be the healthiest patient you have at my age.
Yeah.
And he said, he thought a minute, and he said, well, you probably are. He said, you don't have any real bad habits about drugs or alcohol or smoking, stuff like that, and you've got a positive outlook on life and a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
And been married 47 years, and so
The
all
same
these
woman.
things add up. So it's the same woman, a wonderful woman.
Stay with me. I went to my doctor for last year for physical, and he said, "You're the easiest patient I got."
Good for you. All right, glad to hear it.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Gene.
Thank you.
We've enjoyed sitting there talking with you.
I've enjoyed it too.
Hallelujah. Amen. Glory be.